Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
By giving people agency around their energy, around power, you are giving them power.
This is a moment in time with technological advancement that allows for humans to take advantage of the free aspect of energy.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Power to the People. Derek, welcome back.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here again.
Today we are talking growth. So this is all growth, whether it's you, Mint, the growth of the industry, where it's going. Growth, I kind of want to be the theme because I think we're at this really interesting inflection point in the energy industry where, yes, there's a lot of new solutions. Yes, there's a lot of kind of demand for the power grid. And we've talked a little bit about that, but more so, I want to talk about the growth of just battery storage to start. Like this battery sector is seemingly where a lot of the focus is starting to go. So what does that look like from your end as you like look at things as a CEO? How do you start to plan the growth side of a new sector, so to speak, even within energy?
Yeah, great question. That's a sophisticated one. I think I'll start with, as I've mentioned before, different leaders have different approaches to how they do things. There are some that are a little bit more engineering minded or tactical, or and then for me, I'm always looking at what's actionable now that has value both internally and externally, so company and market, and then hopefully some of the other the secondary, tertiary benefits across environmental impact and or community. But the idea is that what can you make actionable now? So I kind of tend to go so high altitude, global perspective, that I am able to somehow see both, I like to try to see both the near term as applied to the long term. And that they're not, as we know, time's a continuum, and it's not that there's an either or here, but I think it's decision making tends to get positioned is either or, right? We tend to make decisions that are about near future, and then really just kicking the can down the road around long term. And or sometimes we make big bets on what the long term is and then try to reverse engineer that into what near future decisions or actions need to be taken. For me, I feel like, and it's hard to articulate, but I tend to like to do an iterative kind of reflective, right? So if this, then that, and how does that play back and forth? Not necessarily having a super tight grasp on either near future nor long term, just that you're headed in a direction that you have the feeling or the impression, or maybe even some data to speak to. If we do this near term, it does lead into a longer term strategy and play that seems to be fairly probable. So to answer your question succinctly here around storage, battery storage, let's go back a few years. It had become, as costs of storage came down, battery storage came down, and we started looking closely at, solar being a fairly static generation source that has a great payback in general, but it is not necessarily load following. Whereas now adding battery storage, we can begin to offset some of the costs of energy on a, minute by minute, moment by moment, or peak demand kind of way. So load shifting, or what might be better termed load following, that it provided value. Now, if you fast forward to where we are today, what we're seeing is some regulatory pressure that almost forces solar to have to incorporate battery storage due to the lack of pay. And I'm speaking specifically to the PG&E territory, but kind of California in general, in that, and this applies, every region's different, every utility is different. However, this is kind of becoming a more common theme, is that, we're getting paid less for energy that we're generating on site that goes onto the grid and isn't used directly at that moment in time on site. So therefore, storage uh, is almost a must-have in order for things to pencil as well as they have historically for solar. And so battery storage has become fairly ubiquitous. The cost of storage is continuing to come down. I think we're seeing a lot of advancement around onshore development and efforts on U.S. made storage, or at least assembled. And so we're continuing to see, an improvement to the value of storage, both on the utility side. And again, it's a kind of a complex matrix in that there's the game that's being played against the utility costs. There's the metrics that come along with how that energy is being used, or how that site is using the energy. And this is behind the meter stuff, which is most of our focus. And then there's this kind of um, uh, nuance to the storage cost and how it's priced per kilowatt hour and things like that, and the technology itself being improved. And there's a lot that goes into that we're obviously always kind of mapping in real time. All that to be said, virtual power plant conceptually, and the idea of just being a virtual power plant, just for layman's, in layman's terms, for the average bear out there, is just simply a kind of a network of connected stored energy, or generated and site generated and stored energy being deployed at any given time across other use cases, other sites, where you're essentially taking this ever flowing and stored energy and utilizing when necessary in certain areas. And so where there might be a demand, in California, certainly we're maxing out the grid. And so it's being contemplated as a bit of a panacea against grid, these brownouts or grid chunks of the grid being shut down, in that there's other areas on the grid where this energy is just sitting kind of dormant and could be utilized. So the strategy that we're kind of looking at and the growth that we're seeing is this panacea of stored energy in a nodal networked way, is really fundamental. And so for us, it's how many batteries can we get out there and get under management, so that as the virtual power plant programs are being rolled out, pilot programs are being rolled out through the regional community choice aggregators, community choice energy, kind of these clean energy utility adjuncts. We think that there's a future where we can add value to both our client side, our customer side, our site hosts, as well as for us, and improve the grid performance, therefore protecting our communities. And so what's working near term is also seeding our belief in what we think is going to be incredibly valuable down the road, which is having lots and lots and lots of batteries on lots and lots of different sites under our management, with software controlling it all, that can then be fed into some of these programs, kind of lovingly being called virtual power plant.
I like that.
Yeah, so the growth to me is like, it's hard to put it into a static strategy. It's more so this ever evolving thing. And again, which requires that you're both mapping what you think the future is going to look like against what's actually happening now, and kind of iterating as you move forward.
Well, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into that idea of load following, or load shifting as it traditionally has been known. So tell me a bit about just how that effectively works and why battery actually makes a difference. Because the first thought in my mind was like, yes, you have the people who have solar already and might add battery storage, but like, is there a play realistically where you can use grid power for battery
Yeah,
to just
standalone
charge the
storage
battery?
is,
Yeah.
I think, actually, you know, our partner here, Rob Hines, our Chief Development Officer, often says this, to remind people that there's more than enough solar going onto the California grid in the middle of the day than is needed. And it's just that solar, as you know, is following the sun, right? It produces less in the morning and less in the evening and more in the middle of the day. So the idea that storage goes right in with solar, so that it can kind of balance that and store up some energy when it's not being used, and deploy it against when it's needed most. That's all what that kind of peak shaving load shift um, is. That's what that's talking about. However, standalone storage is something that we're very bullish on here at Mint for a couple of reasons. One is the one that I just started the conversation sharing, right? That there's a future in which more batteries on the grid is better for everybody. Two, there are many sites that are space constrained where solar is not a fit, right? And so the idea is certainly you want to generate energy that your site is going to use and then utilize a battery to balance that all out well. However, sites where you just can't put solar, let's talk about a high rise or a hotel or something like that in a city environment where there's just not a good opportunity for solar, there's an opportunity for standalone storage that I'm not even going to try to speak to at the technical level that where this can be, where this goes, but in very simple terms, it's buying low and selling high, meaning it's taking energy from the grid at its cheapest and then deploying that energy against the highest cost of energy from the grid for that site, right? So they're arbitraging energy with using a battery. That said, there's a tremendous amount of push, as I was mentioning earlier, from the people that are in the know, the smart people that are looking at the grid holistically, saying, hey, this panacea of stored energy on the grid in a networked way is going to solve for a lot. Those batteries stand what we're calling standalone storage, or what is commonly called standalone storage, meaning there's nothing else, just a battery connected to that building, connected to the grid. That is something we're really excited about for a few reasons. I mentioned two there, that there's the space constraint where you really just can't do solar, where a standalone battery has economic benefit to the site host as well as benefit to the grid, and then potentially other revenue streams. There's call outs for stored energy at moments in time in the middle of summer where the grid's being maxed out and they're going, hey, let's flex this power in to soften that a little bit. There's a monetary value for being available, that stored energy being available for that. And so there's multiple future revenue streams for that battery. And so we think it's a fantastic opportunity for those that typically just kind of go, well, there's not much we can do with clean energy at this site. Standalone storage is certainly a great play. And so the final kind of take for us again is that we want to be a part of building out this network of stored energy assets, so that we can help solve the problem at the macro level, grid level, because we've got a portfolio of energy storage assets. And yes, it's a good business strategy for us, and it's part of the solution, which is we like not the either or, but the and, right? It's good for our business, and it's good for the community, and it's good for the grid, and it's good for California. So we love that.
I will. How do you choose a path, though? Like what I mean by that is, like, how do you choose a path as this is developing at honestly such a rapid rate? But then you also have the other side of, like, you can benefit from. So let's take a bigger organization that might be an event space. You have a bunch of people coming in and out. They have a bunch of variable energy cost of whatever's going on. Economically, of course, it offsets it. And there's numerous different ways to do it, much like it is where we can achieve whatever needs to be done for, an asset, a building, whatever, for the clean energy plan. How do you decide what is the best path forward when there is like 5, 10, 15 paths? Because I always found, like, when you go high and go low and you kind of go clouds and look at the details and the short-term gains, it can almost feel like decision paralysis, where you're like, oh man, if I pull too, how do I make the right call?
Dude, the answer is, for me, is always, if it don't make dollars, don't make sense. Stealing a line from DJ Quick in the 90s. The bottom line is the bottom line, right? Like, I think that's how you make near-term decisions. I'm not a fan of profit over everything and that being a decision-making platform. I don't agree with that. However, I think one quick way to look at avoiding the decision paralysis, as you called it, is to say, take an organization. Some organizations look 3 months ahead and that's it. I mean, they're making decisions about this quarter. Some, like a giant sports stadium, as you mentioned, might be making decisions on a 5-year kind of horizon, right? And so they may have a little bit more of a forward look on strategy and ROI, but I still say, look, build for the future, but it better make sense now. And the rationale behind that is that you could be making bets on a longer term future. Technology could change drastically in the next 5 years. So I say, if it doesn't make you money this year, probably isn't the strongest idea, right? And so I like the things that say, yeah, it makes us money this year or saves us money this year, and boy, it sure looks like a smart decision 3, 4 years from now, right? Now, I did just listen to a podcast with Valor, the founder of Valor mini nuclear reactors, and it was a 2 hour long podcast where um, I'm drawing a blank. His last name's Taylor. I forget. Elijah Taylor. Might be one of the smartest guys I've heard. This kid's only 26 years old. Might be the smartest guy I've heard speak in a long, long time. And I don't mean like technically smart. I think he's playing chess at a very, very high level that potentially ends up as like global energy change, right? Um, and one of the things that kind of arose for me in listening to this is that decentralizing very clean, very predictable energy from small nuclear reactors. And I'm talking about the size of a shipping container that could, ultimately power a small town, right? And that they have sites on having the first one up and running in Utah by July 4th of next year, 26. Well, you start going, dude, what are we spending all this time on solar for? I mean, that just fixes everything. However, it doesn't really, right? It's all the above are needed. And I don't want to go too deep into the weeds on how nuclear energy works. Decentralized, smaller reactor nuclear energy is fixing a huge problem for our society and potentially energy at the global scale, but it doesn't solve for everything. And one of the things that he brings up is like batteries are great, but they're not great at moving energy. They're heavy, they're big. I mean, the energy density is not that great. Energy per weight or per square foot. Um, Compared to other things. So for instance, if we're going to launch a rocket into space, we're not using batteries. I mean, we're still using fluorocarbons, right? Or whatever. And it's still some form of fuel. And nuclear can help generate the energy to generate that fuel, which is the most portable and energy dense per weight. And so is there a way to create clean carbon-based fuel with nuclear, as well as fortify the grid and do all the things that we think that a decentralized power source would do? However, when you look at an existing building, there's not much better than current battery technology being dropped into a parking spot on that site that can do all this wonderful things for the grid and for that site. So I think we have to, as a community, as a society, as people in the energy space, really remember it's all the above. And really, we should be grateful. I love that Elijah Taylor brought this up in this podcast, is that we need to be very cognizant of how we got here and how grateful we should be for the quote unquote fossil fuels. There's a cleaner way of generating those types of combustion based fuels moving forward that I think we should be paying attention to, because they're still very portable. They're still very useful. Um, and so I think we have to remember it's all the above. Don't forget the past. Don't just write it off as like that was stupid. It got us here, right? Should we have invested more in nuclear programs in the past? Probably. Should we have gotten a little bit further along with solar and battery storage? Sure. But at the end of the day, if you look at the long arc, all of it's necessary, and none of it is a cliff where we just stop doing this and start doing that. It becomes this kind of homogenous, kind of unique play of all the fuel sources from an energy standpoint. I think Mint has its arms really strongly wrapped around solar technology, battery storage technology, starting to get into some, natural gas generators that are kind of a new technology that are clean, very, very clean comparatively, again, a bridge to the future. So I forget what your question was.
No, you're good. I honestly just think I think there's so much animosity towards fossil fuels, in the sense of like, oh my gosh, they're the worst people ever. at the same time, they're actually some of those companies are actually some of the biggest investors in clean energy. It's like they see the wall coming too. They see the transition happening. It's one of those things where like society is always progressing and there's always this long arc. Um, and yeah, you have to just figure out what point you are on that arc and continue to improve every day. Whether that be a 1% or a 2% improvement, it's like
There's going to be a
that's what
day
it's about.
down 10 years from now where, the grid's running off these decentralized, network of nuke. And we're going to look back and look at how dirty solar was, right? And how dirty it was to deploy solar comparatively. And so I think you got to remember, God, I can't help but bring up this analogy that it's like when I was young, it was a little bit like, how dumb are my parents? Like, how stupid it was the old way of doing things. I wanted to change everything. I'm not going to. And then once you become a parent and have kids, you realize your parents were really wise and doing the best they could with what they had. You know what I'm saying? And so, like, I feel like it's a little bit of a juvenile approach to be so like negative on oil and gas, right? Like, dude, it's not the way forward forever. I get that. And, but it is kind of silly to say that we wouldn't have the opportunity to do anything right if we weren't basing it on the shoulders, standing on the shoulders of those that came before us, where they did do the hard work of getting fuel that allowed for industrial revolution and allowed for job growth and GDP and all the things that go into our ability to come up with new technologies that are cleaner. So, have a little bit of grace for, like, I think in general terms, obviously there's the profiteers. We know how oil and gas has gone and it monopolized, but so is media, so is everything else. Like, just
Hmm.
kind of, I think,
Any industry.
get off our soapbox a little bit and just
Yeah.
go, what do we do? How do we do the best with what we have now with as much of a look forward as possible? And I think that that's kind of finding that neutral radical center is what I've been calling it lately. Like, just get centered in just acceptance of what was, a hope for what is coming, and do the best with what you have now is a really healthy viewpoint. And it allows for you to not be so judgmental as to cut off opportunities for win-wins, right? Um, Again, I'm getting a little esoteric in the way that I think, but yeah, dude, like nuke. I mean, I was listening to this podcast going, dude, it's over. Like, what's the point in trying to like go do all this solar? But the more that I listened and the more that I thought about it, I was like, look, it's going to be all the above. And it's totally necessary because part of where these mini nukes are going to be going, first and foremost, is to these gigawatt, demands of AI data centers, right? They're not necessarily first and foremost going to go fix the grid. It's going to be like, how does this 3 million square foot data center get powered where it can't from the grid? Oh, and by the way, why does that matter to us? Because we have to keep up with China and whoever. Like, we have to stay relevant around AI because if the wrong group was ahead in AI, it could be deleterious for all of humanity, right? So the idea is we need to keep some balance there. And and so it's an important factor that we're able to power these data centers where they're not crushing the grid. And so over time, once they're proven there with the big money, it'll begin to get deployed, I think, in these areas around the grid. So, um,
I also think it's just that process of like I almost want to think we're building our own Swiss Army knife of like this is great for wind, this one solar, this one for this data centers, nuclear. Like it's this idea of like it is going to be everything kind of part of that
yeah,
grid
and
because
that was something that I think Elijah Taylor really. It's, by the way, it's on the Sean Ryan show if anybody wants to look it up. But um, that's something he goes into is like, dude, if everybody were to go and stretch in innovation and application in whatever their space is, whether it's solar or wind or whatever the thing is, linear generators, whatever, push and as hard as you can. What we do is we end up getting an organic leveling effect of that is just the nature of things or the way the universe works, where the stuff that makes the most sense will survive and grow and it will feed into this ecosystem that is all these different forms of energy generation or utilization. And the things that just don't make sense just won't, right? And so we all have to go as entrepreneurs and inventors and engineers and what just push. Um, it's a big problem, but I've gone from being in fear around the energy crisis to being very just excited because the smartest minds in the world are putting their attention on this. And I think it is fundamentally the bedrock of all society, right? Is energy and how it's utilized and distributed. So,
arguably from the beginning of time,
yeah,
like making fire was
100.
a form of energy.
We grew up in, getting our history, in school from, the idea that this massive change to humanity occurred at the, when we discovered fire, right? And before that, it was, I think, you could even look at agricultural societies utilizing the sun, this ever present, always there, but like, how do we make a different application, right? As opposed to just, you know, and I think that that's really one of the things Mint does well is look at what's available and then how to make it, how to transform the application of it. So we're not necessarily innovators of technology as much as we're scouring the technology landscape and looking for different applications. And that's a unique fit in the market is kind of an applications company. What can we take that exists that maybe was built or designed or envisioned as being applied in one way, and all of a sudden we see a different connection over here where what if we did it here too? And I think that if you look back and go, some of the earliest agrarian societies, they were just realizing, hey, the sun's always shining. What if we plant it as opposed to just waiting for nature to provide? Like, what could we do with that? Oh, can we store some of that food? That's a breakthrough. So, as kind of a analogous to like, that's what I see happening right now. Massive push in the technological advancement, but also there's folks like Mint out there going, how do we apply this tech in a different way? So
I'd imagine the application side too is a slightly less, and what I mean by slightly less is actually slightly, barely, slightly less risky than doing the technology yourself. It's like I do think we have the engineering capacity, meaning the team, we could dream up huge ideas and go, yeah, let's get after it. But I often think sometimes if you're competing always in the innovation space, one, there's a lot that don't make it. But secondly, are you serving the community, whether it be the world, the county, whatever it is? Are you serving them in the best way if you're not applying it? And I think that that partnership of like always keeping an eye on technology and then being able to apply it, we're actually helping implement that incredible innovation in a way that I don't think even those people who invented it would envision.
100%. Yeah. There's, I look, you're right. It might be less risky. But it's also the other side of that conversation because I don't think we're risk averse here. I think we tend to be willing to take massive risk. I think that the thing that we say is, or at least where it comes from my standpoint, is the idea that I have an aversion to the idea that you go build a product for a specific application, spend a ton of time making that product great as best as you think it can possibly be for that application. Then by the time you roll it out to the market, it just becomes a marketing device of like how many people in that space want to buy my thing. But by the time you've done that, you may have missed something. So you're married to an idea. Whereas in the application side of things, where it looks like less risk because yes, we are not marrying ourselves to one idea. We're allowing ourselves, so it's less risk, but I think the reason it functions this way is because it allows for us to be lighter on our feet. Allows for us to look at where this could be applied in different so most business models say this is what I have to do to get the ball rolling, and then I can go kind of Trojan horse the market and expand in other areas. What I like about us is we'll look at something and go, wait, that's what they built it for, and oh, did they think about this? And then a lot of times we've been on the phone with the people that have the tech and go, have you considered this working over here, in this way? And they go, no, right? So it's both a reinforcing factor for new technology development if you have people that are looking for applications, and it allows us to be lighter on our feet and solve, I think, new and different problems. So at the end of the day, where you have the inventor of the technology taking risk there, we're taking risk in that we're looking at the invention of application, right? Connecting dots that maybe others haven't seen. And so I think there is a risk in that. We are going, hey, what if? Let's try it. Oh, if that works, then we've just opened up a whole new market for that technology, right? So
I mean, when we were talking years ago, like probably when we first met, I was like, "What are you working on?" You're like, "Decentralization of the energy grid." And at the time, it was like, "Dude, that's a wild idea. That's crazy." You fast forward to now, and it's like, "Huh." Now it's
Wow.
weirdly part of the conversation. And I think that's the exciting part about the risk side is like it allows for that risk of the application, the strategy, you can put the risk over there, knowing that there's a need in general for this because otherwise people wouldn't be inventing it. Now it's like how do we find the best use of everything across the board, which also doesn't marry us to solar or
Right.
LNG, whatever it is. It allows us to go, what's the best solution for humanity, which I think is a huge differentiating factor than just what's the best for this company.
That's
And when
why.
dollars are making sense,
Yeah.
it's all a win.
Yeah, that's why you've never heard me ever say that we're a solar company. We're a clean energy company, right? And I would go so far as to say the new technology around nuclear is clean energy. And so it's actually, you know, Valor's arguing it's the cleanest form of energy ever, right? I think that's, potentially subjective. I mean, the guy's got a lot of good data, but the point being that we aren't ever married to one technology or one application of that technology. Um, and so what that does is allows us to solve for the bigger problem. Again, doing with the best with what we have today while contemplating near and long term future. Um, it's a lot
Have you
of
ever had a moment where you, like throughout this, where you went, man, I think we're going this direction, and then it flipped the other way?
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
dude, if you ask the team, it's going to be more than what I'm telling you. But yes, absolutely.
How do you react and pivot to that though? Like
Well,
how do you
because I
react as a
don't,
CEO?
yeah. Well, typically it's a little bit of the same strategy that I'm talking about with the market in this balance between near term and long term. I think that we're that way on new strategies or new efforts. Is that we're going all in, but we're not by not necessarily burning the ships. So it's a little bit of like this is what we want to go do. It goes back to this very simple process that I don't. I wish they taught in school, but they don't. And it's that you can ultimately look at a decision that says, okay, this looks like huge upside for all the reasons that Mint cares about: growth of Mint, betterment of our community, our clients, so on and so forth. This looks like a home run. What I was never taught and had to learn over the years in business is that I need to be very, very closely acquainted with worst case scenario. And I don't spend a ton of time on it. What I do is go, what would worst case scenario look like? What would our reaction be to that? And then what would the outcome look like? And if I can live with that, and so it's basically a backup strategy to worst case scenario, which is like, okay, what would we do? How would that work? So what happens is we have taken none of it being so radical that we truly had to pivot. But there's, think of the branches on a tree. It's a little bit like that, but you still have the trunk of the tree. So worst case scenario is that branch gets cut off. We're back at the trunk of the tree and we got to start looking at growing a new branch, right? So um, I guess that's again, a very kind of esoteric answer to a simple question. But the idea is that we love to go explore what's possible and what the highest potential is, knowing that it could be a miss. And if it is, we already know what we're going to do about that. So another thing about remaining light on your feet in an applications company is that you're able to adjust without having to like think about if you go all in and building one technology, you bring it to market, it just somehow the market evolved quicker than you did, and the technology just isn't as important as you thought it would be. You just blew up the company. I mean, it's essentially difficult to pivot from that or to play out a different worst case scenario strategy. It's a big deal. So I think that it also says that we're working, you know, multiple mini strategies against one kind of larger strategy. And so, yeah, we have definitely done some things like, okay, here's an example. The other thing that I love to remind myself is nothing ever lost, only ever gained. And that means that we spent, dude, 6, 7 hard years of going after the real estate space as a market for what we do. It never got the traction we thought it would, right? Which is us going to real estate owners and investors saying, "Hey, you're already investing in real estate. Let us show you an ancillary or a creative investment strategy for your own real estate using clean energy." We worked really, really hard. and went through lots of iterations on how to bring that to market to that segment. It's not that it didn't work. It did. It just didn't get massive traction. Interestingly enough, there was two reasons that I think that, well, I don't want to go into the reasons. I'll just say that the market's matured. And so we were a little bit ahead of our time. So now that conversation's happening. But guess what? Those 7 years that we thought, most people would say that's kind of a fail, right? You didn't get the lift off you thought you would in that space. But what we did is became experts in that space. So now that the market matures and those folks are now saying, wait, we need to talk about this. We've already got all the reps. We've gotten our head kicked in enough times to know what's what, right? So now we're great there. The other thing that happens is you learn enough about that space in trying to penetrate that somebody that's actually at a much larger scale, but not necessarily who you thought that space was, comes to you and says, hey, we have a whole strategy for clean energy across, national footprint. But you weren't even thinking of them as the people that you were building for over the last 7 years. But now that conversation starts and you go, oh, by the way, we know your space really, really well, right? So again, sometimes you have to turn hard lessons into part of that worst case scenario is saying, what did we learn along the way? And so for me, every $10,000 mistake is $1 million lesson. And how do you just can't let go of the information that you gained along the way. So yeah, I don't know.
I think they're very popular in startups to throw pivot around. Like, we pivoted. I don't particularly like that word because, to your point, all of it is part of the growth process, the learning, the mistakes, the evolution. Yeah.
Evolution's the word I have always used. I think they use pivot because it's a way of acknowledging what they were doing didn't work. And again, it's that product development model, which is we're going to go spend a bunch of time and money and effort developing something that we think the market wants, and then we're going to go release it in the wild and hope it catches on like we thought. And when it doesn't, you have to pivot. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have a customer development model, which is go do customer discovery, go understand your market, that's a moving target. And the more time you spend on that, the more that you can. And so you have to be light enough on your feet to go back to the lab and iterate on what you think your product is. That's the thing that saved us, or made us great, I guess, over the last decade, is that model versus the other one. So we don't have to say pivot, because when you have a customer development model, which is out building the market, and then bringing that information back and saying, how do we tweak and tune for best application in the market? You don't ever have to pivot. You just keep evolving. It's iterative.
I also think that's such a great a lesson for where business is going. I think with your invention of everything with AI and all the applications of the ubiquitous nature of knowledge at this point, it's going to be about depth. Like, not just depth of the knowledge, depth of the experience and the people and the customer and the true understanding of it, not just the acknowledgement of the knowledge itself.
Two words come up for me, which is discernment and application, right? So if knowledge is ubiquitous, what becomes important? Discernment, right? Then from that discernment, what is the distinction between, if everybody has equal access to knowledge, it's the application of that knowledge. So what is that? So discerning and then making meaning out of it. And that is something I think that's baked into our DNA here. So I'm excited about that. But I think that's something that needs to be taught to our kids. They're growing up in a way that we could never have imagined, or I could never have imagined.
I couldn't have.
But the idea is discernment needs to be taught, and that's probably in and of itself something that I'm using that word like I know what that looks like in the world of AI, and I don't, right? I mean, mm-hmm. I know that it's a truth, but I don't know how to apply that truth, right? But I do think that back to the application of that knowledge as being a very important thing. So
I also think the values around why you're doing something, I think, are going to become even more important, because the ease of being able to accomplish something, even at a smaller scale, I think is going to get easier.
Great point, dude.
And I think so much is based on the quarterly earnings, the whatever. And yes, if you were to take sustainability and redefine it outside of how society has kind of done it, it is the sustainability of a business. So it has to make money in order to have a bigger impact, in order to sustain and actually do good for the society. However, the why behind the business, I think, is not just profit driven anymore. I actually think it's starting to shift a bit to, why does this matter in the bigger picture? because throwing more money at more problems doesn't necessarily make things better.
You're getting my wheels turning in a weird way right now, which is the idea that on one hand, it's so obvious that AI can be soul sucking, right? That it's taking the fundamental humanity out of humanity. But what you're causing me to think about here is that, is there a derivative effect that is actually a doubling down on a spiritual concept or spiritual principles of the reason why we do something having more value than the actual thing from a monetary or just, I mean, I think there's an economic implication of AI that we haven't even, I mean, there are probably people much smarter than me that are thinking about it, but that we're not talking about, at least, right? That is freaking massive. And so I'm curious as to wonder if, um, to your point, if really the economy starts to put a premium on those that have a deeper mission or a deeper reason or a human centric or biocentric rationale for their application of that knowledge than those that don't, right? Because that's interesting to me. I think that we already know that exists in business for the most part, or it's becoming more and more a part of the conversation. Maybe we go back 30 years, it was not very important, but now it certainly is. But I wonder if AI is going to cause that to be even a compounding effect on that. That idea that the why matters more than the what, so to speak.
Well, I read an article, and again, don't know completely the validity of this, so don't quote me. But ballpark, when you start really using AI all the time, they did a study of people's brains, and I guess your brain function drops by like 30%.
Yeah.
And it's like, so how are you leveraging your brain power? If the AI is doing it and you're not using your brain power, what can you use your brain power for? And I think with that newer generation that's coming in, there's so much technology. It's like, they're like, hey, I want to do something that I enjoy.
I hear these conversations and I'm like, wait a second. Okay, let's just push pause. For an example, there was a point where when cars were invented and people had to run, walk, or ride a horse, that they were like, this is going to turn us all into fat, lazy slobs, right? I'm assuming. However, fast forward 100 and some years, and there's still people, I look out my window, running down the street, but they're doing it for a different reason.
Yes.
They're not doing it to catch the freaking, the thing they're going to eat. They're doing it for enjoyment or for health, right? So it's different. So then I go look at AI. Could I program it, write up something to where AI creates a better piece of artwork than I could? I bet you 100%, right? How am I going to feel hanging that thing on my wall versus the thing that I took hours and hours of my own effort and time and to try to create? So yes, AI is going to make better art than we can. However, when I just look at the behavioral aspect of it, and I go, wait, how proud am I going to be to hang that on my wall or to gift to somebody versus the one that I actually created? Mm-hmm. So I think that we'll find that what seems like an AI it's so much more complex than the automobile, right? But it's what it's doing to society. But if you look at it in context, time capsule it, the car was a massive, or the Industrial Revolution was a massive change to humanity. And yet we ended up taking what was a sentinel, like massive shift in our consciousness around how we live our lives. But over time, you look back and we just turned it into a tool. So to some extent, this is a more integrated tool into the fabric of society, AI, but it's still just going to be a tool, in my opinion, right? It is not this outmoding of humanity in any way. It's not. Now, of course, there are people that make a living driving a car most of the time, right? It's a tool for them to make a living. There are going to be people that are plugged into AI most of the time. And what does that do? So the guy that drives, we already know the guy that drives, most of his waking hours has a different health, typically a different health profile than somebody who doesn't, right? So the same way you just brought up that AI makes us dumber, utilizing AI a lot makes us dumber. It's true. The people that are plugged into AI all day long may get dumber in what we think normal intelligence looks like, but they're going to be really freaking smart at prompting, right? They're going to be really smart at some shit that we're not. And yet the rest of us, I think, are going to find that over time, it just becomes a backdrop foundational tool for how to live life better.
I almost think about it like load shifting. It's like, if we look at our brain almost like an energy system, it's like we're load following.
Part of what I think is going to be fun about AI is right now, we know how to fix the grid, right? Individually, we all have our hypothesis, and I'm just using this as an example. However, getting all the right stakeholders into one room to agree on that is going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because they have different incentives and interests and whatever. However, when you start to rely on a centralized collective of intelligence, where it now says, hey, by the way, here's the model for how to fix the grid. Here's a directive to each of the stakeholders on how their part in that, but this is the thing that fixes it. And oh, by the way, nobody's going to go broke in the process. And oh, by the way, it's going to be better long term. But we can follow that, where, again, we have to remember that AI is just an amalgamation of all of the knowledge, just centralized. So the way we ask it questions is subjective and it's going to spit out different answers. But my point is I like the idea that if we look at the government level, it's the inefficiency and bureaucracy. What happens when there's a central thing that says, no, we've done all of this thinking on this. We've run all the scenarios, thousands, millions, whatever, all the data in there. And oh, by the way, this is how you do it. And this is how you do it without anybody going upside down, right? Or whatever. And then everybody goes, okay, cool. Now let's just go formulate a plan to go do that, right? So I'm just super elementary example, but I think there's a future where it becomes this tool to move us forward in the way we already know we want to go forward. It's just, how do we all get on the same page?
Yeah, I've been seeing there's sometimes people will go, oh man, I wish, life is so hard nowadays. And like, yes, there are challenges that people face. Don't get me wrong. There's still the human challenge of your life getting over obstacles throughout life. But when you think about society in general, one, we live longer, we have more access to food, we have more energy, we can live more comfortably, we turn on the light switch in the water and it somehow comes out. Like that advancement in society, at least in a lot of metropolitan cities and stuff like that, we have advanced so much over the years that if you were to take the struggle of somebody in the 1920s versus now, they would go, you softies, man.
Totally.
Yeah. It's just an iteration.
Also, at the same time, those folks were figuring out how their city or their neighborhood should survive.
Can get better.
With, at this point, the awareness of how does all of humanity or life on this planet survive. So we are soft in day-to-day, experience, but we're not, in that we're thinking about solving at a much bigger problem or much bigger level than the folks that had to go pull the water out of the well. They were 100%. Like, how do I keep this farm alive? We're sitting here with the stress and concern of how do we keep the, planet from getting super fucked up. I got to find a way not to go off the deep end with stuff.
No, that's part of the fun of the podcast. Well, thanks. That's it for this episode of Power to the People. Thanks, Derek, and we'll be back on the next show.
Talk soon. Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
By giving people agency around their energy, around power, you are giving them power.
This is a moment in time with technological advancement that allows for humans to take advantage of the free aspect of energy.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.